say that our business is stronger than it has ever been.
The success of growth and where I see companies growing consistently really is your people.
I mean, the story is not, does it make power? Because they all make power. The story is, what does it power?
This is What Solar Installers Need to Know with your hosts Hervé Billier and Joe Marhamati.
Hi there, it's Hervé and Joe with What Solar Installers Need to Know, where we interview solar CEOs and experts on how they run their business on the solar coaster. We ask their private revenue numbers, we give actionable advice, and learn about trade secrets so you can run and grow your solar business. Joe and I built a solar company from 0 to 12 million in sales and got successfully acquired. If you'd like to do the same or do better, go to sungrow.com/blog to get actionable behind-the-scenes lessons on running and growing your solar business. And now, without further ado, let's jump right into the next episode. Hi, and welcome to another episode of What Solar Installers Need to Know. Welcome to the podcast, Heather.
Thanks, I'm really excited to be here.
And Heather, we've been working together quite for some years at Ipsen Solar. But before you got into the solar industry, you had a full career at Schneider Electric for, I believe, 6 years?
Yeah, so I was at Schneider Electric for about 6 years. I came through an acquisition with them through a smaller company, and I've been in HR for a little over 20 years now.
20 years. And I know you like merger and acquisitions. You told me that once, which is a very different conversation. But you also have your own company right now, RCR Consulting Group. Tell me a bit about that company. How many other solar companies do you have as customers?
Absolutely. Ipsen, and working with Hervé, you were one of our first clients that we ever worked with in the solar space. And really helped us get our start. Today, we support 12 different solar companies across the United States of varying sizes, anywhere from a couple of employees all the way up to about 150 employees is our largest solar company that we support today.
All right. Well, maybe my first question to you is about HR horror stories. Maybe not about the solar specific, but can you tell us about some specific stories you had to deal with?
Gosh, there's so many. I think that's a hard one to narrow down. I will share one that recently came up that was a first for me, which doesn't come up very often anymore. But we had a situation where an employee reached out to us that they wanted to change their name, which isn't abnormal, right? I mean, that happens. People get married, divorced, what have you. And when they provided us the document, it was a full name change. So they were changing their first name and their last name. And as we started looking at the paperwork a little bit more, we also noticed that the date of birth on the ID was different than the original date of birth that they had submitted to us.
It's hard to change.
Which immediately from an HR thing, right, my spidey sense goes off and we had to start digging into it. And we actually found out that this employee had been subject to a fraud situation. And so she needed to go and reissue everything, her social security card, her IDs. We needed to update her entire profile. We needed to do retroactive returns on her because she basically had almost an entire new identity, and how you have to navigate that to obviously make sure that we don't have a broader employee identity theft situation. So just a unique one that recently came up. Weird, right? I can see what you're facing. You're going what? But these are the things that come up in HR.
How did you change the birthday? How can somebody change their birthday?
Right. Well, apparently her original documents have been fabricated. So, using things like E-Verify, which is required now in a lot of states, to help identify and verify documents becomes really important to help substantiate that somebody is who they say they are, and helps verify that the documents are real. And just that I-9 process, right? It's one of those administrative tasks that come in of wanting to make sure that I-9 documentation is right and that somebody's looking at it and, looking at the picture to make sure, hey, is this the person who says that they are? And that sort of thing. And it's getting to have a lot more attention, right? And, I know there's a lot of cuts that are happening in different parts of the government, but this is an area that is getting a lot of attention, right? Wanting to make sure you're hiring people that are legally allowed to be working in the United States. And one of the areas that they're talking about funding is to come in and start doing more I-9 audits, which hadn't been a thing previously.
Yeah. All right. Well, speaking about what actually happens today in maybe politics, but in the solar industry, there's a lot going on. Over the years, she spoke more about hiring and what needs to happen there, how to have that process. Don't really want to speak about firing at the moment, but a lot of solar companies are really kind of rethinking how they run their business, like strategy or process improvement. One key aspect that I believe is about accountability. You can't do anything if nobody feels accountable. So I remember having a lot of long thoughts about how to to improve accountability, do you have any advice or any ideas about how to improve accountability in a solo company?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big pieces needs to start when you first hire somebody, right? So there are people who innately gravitate towards being accountable as individuals, and looking at that through the interview process and helping to make sure that you're hiring people that have and share that similar mindset of what you're looking for in the organization. And then to me, it starts day one of the employment process, right? Making sure you're setting very clear expectations. What are you expecting them to accomplish? What are their deliverables? What are those goals that you are setting? Making sure you're meeting with that employee regularly to help set that expectation, addressing things as soon as it happens. Human nature, I feel like a lot of times we tend to avoid conflict.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a situation, right? If you see it, say something, address it. Make sure you address it in a professional manner, right? Don't do it in front of people. Be respectful, right? In that communication, seek to understand maybe why they didn't do something or what may be happening or why they're calling out, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So to increase accountability, it starts at the beginning when you hire people, set up expectations correctly, have job descriptions, adjust your job descriptions. Now, for management team, when it's like, well, we have already job descriptions in place, what is something else where they can make sure, because you can delegate things to people, but if they don't take it and run with it, they don't feel ownership, then it's not happening. So there's only so much you can do by delegating or giving tasks to people. So is there something else that you can advise to get more accountability in place?
Yeah, so I go back to looking at some of the basics, right? So one of the concepts I know a lot of small businesses follows, like the EOS methodology. And one of the big things that they talk about is right people, right seats, right? So if somebody doesn't, and they also talk about accountability charts, right? So what is that person? What is that seat accountable for and responsible for? And is that person in that seat the right person to deliver on those accountability tasks? One of the things we see a lot in small businesses is a habit of maybe somebody's not performing real great in one role and we decide to shift them to another position. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have the right knowledge, skills, ability to be able to be successful. So that's one of the areas I would say if we start noticing that somebody's not taking that accountability, I would really encourage managers to really take a look at, does that person really understand that role? Are those expectations clear? And are they the right person to be in that seat? To me, I would say is if you're going through and checking all of those and truly are being, I would say, critical of your process and that decision making, 95% of the time, I would say you're going to see a misalignment in one of those four areas.
My next question was about growth in a solo company. What you see is hampering growth. Maybe it's also related to having the right people in the right seat. Right now, a lot of solo companies are either struggling, need to invent themselves, or just want to keep growing instead of just plateauing. Do you have any advice from the HR point of view, what they could do to keep that growth momentum?
Yeah, so I would say to me, I think the success of growth and where I see companies growing consistently, whether it's in the solar space or in other industries, really is your people. It is, I believe, a secret to success. It can be a differentiator in the market, is making sure you have those right people in those right seats, making those tough hiring decisions, whether it is I'm going to wait to find the right person for this role and not settle during the hiring process. I think every manager's been in that spot where we've maybe, settled and then later on regretted and been like, we knew in the beginning this wasn't the right fit, but we were desperate. Don't make those desperate hiring decisions. Balancing to make sure we're, again, holding people accountable. I would say as far as growth, I do see businesses that are, leaning into some of the areas that other businesses aren't wanting to grow. So especially with like the Inflation Reduction Act that's out there. And if you do some of the larger types of commercial projects that may need you to do some certified payrolls and are subject to prevailing wage, we know that some businesses are shying away from that because it's scary, right? There's a lot of compliance, a lot of reporting. That's a new area that most solar companies haven't dealt with if you're not in the government contracting space. And because of that, a lot of businesses there's opportunity out there and a lot of businesses aren't taking advantage of it.
Another piece is where you were at Schneider Electric, and there was a quote of yours where you said like you would use 25% labor hour savings by stopping inefficient meetings. You have some companies where you have too many meetings where you can be inefficient. I also noticed one company had just no meetings anymore at all. Like nobody from management speaks to the employees anymore. Speak to me about like, could you explain to our audience about having the right meetings in place? Not to so what balance are you looking for?
Yeah, so I think every business is different, right? On what those needs are. It definitely depends on, are you an in-person organization? Are you a remote organization, right? Again, your installers may need a different level of support than if you've got, your project managers that may not be reporting into an office, and how that support is happening. As far as finding that right balance, right? I would say making sure we're very intentional with meetings. Why are we having this meeting? Who needs to be on this meeting? Finding opportunities of, does somebody need to be on just maybe the first part of that meeting for that discussion, and be on the entire time, or do they need to be on the entire time, right? So do you stage that meeting, right? So if you need to have, maybe 5 people that are a core part of leadership on that meeting, we need, maybe HR in for the first 10 minutes, you need project management in for the next 10 minutes, and have it scheduled, giving people the authority and empowering them, right? And again, this gets into some of that accountability piece, where empower employees to say, hey, this doesn't make sense for me to be on this meeting. And giving them that latitude to be able to speak up and saying, hey, I may not always need to be on this meeting. Or doing things like, hey, let's touch base and say, do we actually need to have this meeting today? Type of conversation. I would say the reverse is opposite too, where we see a lot of inefficiencies is employees or teams, right, that go back and forth on email, where if they had just picked up the phone and had a quick 2-minute conversation, it would have solved the problem and we would have resolved it. So there's a balance. So, helping provide those guidelines, again, empowering employees to be able to speak up and say, hey, this doesn't necessarily make sense, or, I don't need to be on this entire meeting, or maybe it doesn't need to be a weekly meeting. Maybe it needs to be every other week, and periodically doing those assessments. It's so easy for us to get stuck in a rut, or just kind of get in that habit of like, I'm just used to every Wednesday at 10 a.m., I'm going to have this meeting and this is what happens, and not sit back and question periodically and say, does this meeting still make sense? Are we accomplishing what we need to accomplish?
Yeah, one thing is to change the length of a meeting. If you have 1 hour meetings all the time, can you just not change it to a 30-minute meeting and see if you always go longer, you need a 1 hour. But I also feel like if you always put 1 hour, you're going to use the entire 1 hour. So changing just the regular cadence of the meeting, just make it, does regular cadence meeting make it 30 minutes instead of 1 hour, makes a big difference too. There's another piece where when you walk into a company, maybe when it becomes a new customer of yours, what are some hints that you see about this company is well run? Not just from an HR point of view, but just a feeling, or like, are there some hints that really shows you like, this is a strong company that I want to have as a client, or the opposite, like do not want this company as a client because it's never going to work? So can you speak some about those hints?
Yeah. One of the first things we look at is turnover. And in the solar industry, that's a hard one, right? Because you naturally, based off the position, right, you're going to have higher turnover than normal in other positions, right? But there was a group that we worked with where their average tenure was 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
And 6 weeks. And their longest tenured employee had been there for 3 months. And this business had been in existence for about 5 years. That's a huge red flag. Something's broken and something's going on here, right? Now, I would say normally where I'm looking at is, okay, if they're coming and saying, hey, we want to work with HR and we need help, normally I'm like, okay, we can get to the bottom of it. We quickly realized that, for this leader in particular, like they just weren't engaged or wanting to really change. They just wanted to basically shift their problems over to someone else. And that really led, the leader didn't have accountability, right? And so that just led down, it had a trickle effect, right? And so getting to your question as far as like, how do we tell if kind of an organization's got their stuff together, is we definitely look at that piece, right? Employee satisfaction, how committed are employees to the organization? There's definitely those paper aspects of HR, right? Do you have a handbook? Do you have policies, right? Are you in compliance? Those sorts of things. But really at the end of the day, we really look at who's the leader, what do they value, and how are they showing that accountability, right? A big one we look at, not that every leader's here, but do they adhere to some type of that servant leadership mentality? as far as, are they there for their people and are they in this for the right reasons? And if that answer is yes, 95% of the time we can work with them and they've got that basis that we can help to develop an amazing company together.
Interesting. Thank you for those hints. Well, you also mentioned employee handbook. Do most solar companies have it somewhere taking up dust, or is it a tool that is used and every time there is a problem, you're like, what's in that handbook? And either go update it or at least point towards it. Like, what do you see is most common in the industry?
What is most common? It's all over the board. Some don't have any. Some have a handbook and don't follow it. That I would say is probably one of the risky, right? To me, I would say whether you look, from an HR standpoint, I'm always going to recommend having a handbook, right? And then the next piece is making sure you follow it. But with the handbook, it doesn't need to be this super big legalese document. You want it to be something that people can relate to, people can understand, and then you want to follow it. If you're not following your policies, don't have them. That's where we see companies get into a lot of trouble. I was working with a group recently. I love my examples, right? I was working with a group recently. We had an employee complaining that their PTO accrual wasn't correct. PTO is one of those sticky ones because depending on the state you're in, this is an accrued benefit, very similar to wages, and employees can be owed it based off of the way the handbook is. And they were not adhering to the policy. A previous manager who was no longer with the organization had granted written exceptions, which also dangerous, right? But had never actually put those into place. And so we basically had to go back 5 years to correct 5 years of errors. I don't even know if I can call it that because, what was happening in the handbook wasn't happening in their payroll system compared to what the manager said. So we had 3 different things that were happening that we basically had to unpackage.
Sounds fun. You're a friend.
It was.
Well, that brings me to my next question about who do you represent? Is the HR department always representing and helping the CEO and management of the company, or do you help and represent the installers and employees of a solar company, or is it both?
Both. I usually use the analogy for HR. The right HR professional should be a bridge, essentially connecting the two sides and helping to navigate those different views, those different priorities. And there will be times where we are going to push back on employees, and there are going to be times we're going to be pushing back on executives. At the end of the day, though, to me, our role is to support the business and helping a business make the right decision for them, and helping them navigate what does that look like.
You spoke about like the bacon rules and the IRA where there's more opportunity sometimes in commercial solar. I see several residential installers moving more into commercial space. How is that affecting HR? Do you hire the same type of people or is there a different process, maybe amount of people necessary for a job at certain times? What are some big differences HR-wise between residential solar and a commercial solar company?
Yeah, we see differences. One off of, we don't always see success on people that have worked primarily in the commercial space moving into the residential, because the commercial jobs tend to be much bigger. And so it's much more repetitive. And so they may not have had the full depth and breadth of experience. Sometimes on the commercial sides too, they may not have as much experience working like on the roofs and some of those safety protocols and some of the exposure specifically to the electrical work. Not that they're performing work as electricians, but as like an electrical assistant, or that sort of thing. Where the commercial side we see tends to be, again, it's I'm doing this and I'm doing this all day, every day, versus the solar, it's a much smaller ecosystem, right? In the residential, as far as like, I'm doing all of it, right? Type of situation. And so that talent pool is going to be very different. We also see for the commercial, you may need to staff up very quickly for a short period of time to staff that commercial project, where on residential, that work tends to be a little bit more consistent. And so those offer packages, travel, right, is another big one that can come in with the commercial piece as well.
And when we were talking about hiring, I like to hire everybody and give them a chance, a second chance, a 17th chance, and so on. And you have really a skill to talent to identify the right individuals. I think maybe CEOs tend to say like, I can interview and hire people and just go with it. Do you see, is everybody making the same mistake as me? Or do you see maybe at some point CEOs, when they grow their company or to grow and the company, they require to have more HR dedicated people? What do you see there?
Yeah, I think it's, the difference is anybody who's doing something all day, every day, you're going to get practice at it, right? And a different level of experience, right? So from an HR standpoint, right, our job is people, right? We deal with people every day. And so we're able to suss things out through kind of that screening and that interview process that somebody who isn't doing that all day, every day, just isn't going to have the same depth and breadth. Said, there's a lot of different ways that CEOs or any hiring manager can help suss out some of it, right? So there's a really funny YouTube video where it says, like, if somebody was honest in the interview, and it's kind of a mock, and like you ask, why are you here? And she's like, well, because I need to pay my rent. That's not the real reason. I mean, that's not the answer most people are going to give. And so you want to ask questions that are going to help get into those behavioral, right? Or the whole theory that previous behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, right? So asking a lot of behavioral interview questions, looking at what has made somebody successful in this role before, and what questions are we going to ask that are similar to that so that I can see, has this person done it? Do they have it? Are they speaking in specifics? Or are they speaking in generalities? Are they throwing a lot of buzzwords out there? Some of those types of things are the big indicators of, do they actually have what we need? And then last, I really encourage management to hire for personality and fit for the organization versus skills. Most of those hard skills can be taught and trained. Personality is innate, and it's much harder to shift someone's personality.
Recently, I saw an interesting YouTube video about a person flipping the script. It's like, when you are at an interview, why don't you, as a manager, like, oh, you say you're promoting people. Tell me a recent person you helped get promoted, or tell me a recent person you helped train on something that you knew how to do well. It's very fact based. Like, oh, you say you're a good company. Well, explain me very specifically what that means. That was interesting.
Yeah, I had one that recently I was talking to a candidate who was like, yeah, I really value education. I'm constantly trying to, advance myself and learn. I'm like, oh, awesome. Can you tell me about the last training session you attended or the last book that you read? Which to me, if you're saying, hey, I really value this, you should be able to rattle off at least one. And, she was silent, and she's like, I've been really trying to prepare and thinking about going for this, but I'm like, okay, but you're saying you value this, but she couldn't come up with anything in the last 6 months, year of anything that she had done from a professional development standpoint. So you really want to make sure if someone says, hey, I value this, well, yeah, companies want to hear that, but ask them, give me an example.
Now that you mentioned that, I suddenly have to think about a process we had at Ipsen Solar, where when we onboarded people, we had a training role to go through. The onboarding was fully fleshed out with training that I kept writing too about cybersecurity and other pieces that we kept adding and updating so that you have a good, strong onboarding. That was a nice process that I believe you helped set up. So thank you for that. Last question about HR. Does the H stands for heart? Is there any room in the HR world to deal with emotions?
Absolutely. And yeah, some of my HR counterparts may give me evil eyes for that, but I believe what we do, again, we deal with people, we deal with humans. The core part of who each person is their heart. I really encourage all managers, HR, anybody that's interacting with people, we need to be working in empathy, right? We need to take the moment to understand where somebody's coming from and try to put as much as possible ourselves in their shoes. If I was that person, how would I want to be treated? How would I want this to be handled? If I'm not performing, how would I want my manager to address this with me? If I was that person, for what I've communicated to them, do I feel like it's been addressed appropriately? Would I be clear that I'm not meeting expectations, right? What questions, how do I want to be treated? I'm going back to that golden rule, right? Treat others as you want to be treated. And so, yes, absolutely. I think HR definitely has to have heart. I think leaders need to have heart and empathy as they navigate through the organization. And the most successful companies I see put that in the front of what they do.
On those nice, wise words, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Heather, for being on the podcast. If you'd like to do the same or do better, go to sunvoy.com/blog and get actionable behind-the-scenes lessons on running and growing your solo business.